My name is Eve. I'm 32 years old, and I stood at the edge of a hotel banquet hall watching my entire world shatter into pieces. The man I'd loved for 8 years was marrying my best friend. Daniel looked perfect in his navy suit, the same one I'd helped him pick out 2 years ago for a business meeting. Lila wore ivory lace, her blonde hair cascading down her back. They looked like they belonged in a magazine. Everyone around me smiled and clapped while I tried to remember how to breathe. I shouldn't have come. My therapist said attending would set back my healing. But I needed to see it with my own eyes. I needed proof that this nightmare was real. When Lila turned her face toward the crowd during the ceremony, something caught my attention. Her expression shifted for just a second. Fear flickered across her features before she forced the smile back. That was the moment I knew this wasn't over. I replayed that moment in my mind over and over that night. Lila's smirk had been practiced, but there was a nervous twitch in her left eye. Something she always did when lying. I'd known her since college. 13 years of friendship, and I could read her like a book. But what really stuck with me was the necklace. A delicate gold chain with a small diamond pendant rested against her collarbone. My breath had caught in my throat when I saw it. That necklace was mine. Daniel had given it to me on our 5th anniversary. He'd told me he'd lost it during a business trip to Chicago 6 months before our divorce. I'd cried for days, not because of the value, but because it held meaning. Now it hung around Lila's neck like a trophy. That necklace was my anniversary gift. And seeing it there changed everything. The memories came flooding back. 8 months before Daniel asked for a divorce, I'd found strange messages on his phone. Late-night texts with someone saved as architect client. The messages were casual at first, then became flirty, almost intimate. When I confronted Daniel about it, he looked at me like I was crazy. He said I was paranoid, that work stress was making me see problems where none existed. He made me feel guilty for doubting him. I apologized. I actually apologized for being suspicious. The gaslighting worked perfectly. I started questioning my own instincts, my own reality. But now, sitting in my apartment with wedding photos scattered on my coffee table, I scrolled through old screenshots I'd saved. My hands trembled as I went further back in the message thread. Then I saw it. Buried deep in the chat history was a nickname. Lily Pad. That was what we called Lila in college. The betrayal cut deeper when I remembered how Lila had been there for me during those terrible months. She brought me homemade soup when I couldn't eat. She listened to me cry about Daniel's distance and coldness. She told me he was probably just stressed about work, that I should be patient. All while she was sleeping with my husband. She knew everything about our marriage. She knew our finances because I'd asked her for advice when Daniel said we were struggling with money. She knew about our bedroom problems because I'd confided in her during wine nights. She knew my insecurities, my fears, my weaknesses. And she'd used every single piece of information against me. I thought about all those times she'd encouraged me to give Daniel space when I wanted to fight for our marriage. Now I understood why. The day Daniel left replayed in my mind like a horror movie. It was a Tuesday morning in March. He'd come home from a weekend conference and said he needed space to think. He looked tired, distant. I'd agreed to a trial separation, thinking it might help us reset. 2 weeks later, he asked me to sign papers. Not divorce papers yet, just a legal separation agreement. I signed them because I wanted to avoid conflict. I wanted to show him I could be understanding and flexible. Within a month, Daniel had moved into a luxury condo downtown. He said his company was covering it temporarily. I didn't question it because I was too broken to think clearly. Then I found out the truth by accident. A mutual friend mentioned seeing Daniel's new place and casually said, "Lila really found him a great deal." My blood went cold. His real estate agent was Lila. The divorce proceedings were a nightmare. Daniel showed up to court with an expensive lawyer I knew we couldn't afford. Or at least, I thought we couldn't. His attorney presented financial documents that painted me as unstable and reckless with money. They showed credit card charges I didn't recognize and bank statements with withdrawals I never made. I looked like I'd been bleeding our accounts dry. My lawyer seemed confused. I was confused. Everything was moving too fast, and I couldn't keep up. The judge granted Daniel most of our shared assets based on these documents. I was left with almost nothing. Our savings account, which had once held $40,000, was nearly empty. When I finally got access to the transaction history, I noticed something strange. Several large transfers had been authorized from an email address I didn't recognize. I did some digging. That email belonged to Lila. I fell apart completely after the divorce was finalized. Depression wrapped around me like a heavy blanket I couldn't throw off. I stopped eating properly. I stopped sleeping through the night. I'd wake up at 3 in the morning, staring at the ceiling, wondering what I'd done wrong. People in our social circle whispered that I'd driven Daniel away with my paranoia and neediness. Some friends stopped calling. Others gave me pitying looks that made me feel even worse. I became a ghost in my own life. But somewhere in the darkness, a spark of anger started to grow. One night, I made a decision. I would disappear from their lives completely. I deleted social media, changed my phone number, and moved to a smaller apartment across town. But before I vanished, I backed up every single document, email, and message I could find. Something told me I'd need them. 6 months passed in a blur of rebuilding. I found a new job at a small marketing firm. The pay was decent, and my boss was kind. I started seeing a therapist twice a week. I joined a gym and forced myself to go even when I didn't want to. Slowly, I began to feel like myself again. But I wasn't the same person Daniel had left. I was harder, smarter, more cautious. I enrolled in evening classes on business law and financial management. I wanted to understand how I'd been so thoroughly fooled. I wanted to make sure it never happened again. My new lawyer, a sharp woman named Patricia, reviewed my divorce papers and raised her eyebrows. She asked questions my previous lawyer had never thought to ask. After 3 weeks of investigation, Patricia called me into her office with a serious expression. "Eve," she said, "you might have more leverage than you think." Patricia had discovered something crucial. During our marriage, Daniel had purchased 2 investment properties. He'd sworn under oath that he was financially broke, that the business was failing, that we had nothing left. But Patricia found records showing he transferred both properties into Lila's name 3 months before filing for divorce. The transaction date was March 15th. The same week he'd testified in court about being financially ruined. He'd hidden assets deliberately and systematically. This wasn't just a betrayal. It was fraud. Patricia explained that this kind of deception during divorce proceedings was illegal. We could reopen the case. We could go after him for everything he'd stolen from me. But she warned me it wouldn't be easy. Daniel had covered his tracks well. We'd need concrete proof of intent, of conspiracy. We'd need more than just suspicious timing. I told her I'd find it. I didn't know how yet, but I would find it. 2 days later, my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. The text was simple but chilling. "You don't know what really happened the night he left." My hands shook as I opened the attached photo. It showed Daniel and Lila together at a restaurant. They were holding hands across the table, laughing. The date stamp on the photo read February 20th. 2 weeks before Daniel had asked for space. 2 weeks while I was still sleeping next to him every night, believing we could fix things. I stared at the photo until my eyes burned. Then another message came through, "There's more. Much more. Meet me tomorrow at Morrison's Cafe on 5th Street. Come alone. I'll be at the corner table wearing a red scarf." I didn't sleep that night. Part of me wondered if this was a trap. But a bigger part of me needed answers. I texted back a single word, "Okay." The woman waiting at Morrison's Cafe was about my age, with dark hair pulled into a tight bun. She wore the red scarf as promised. When I sat down, she introduced herself as Nina. She'd been Daniel's executive assistant for 3 years. She'd quit 2 months ago. Nina looked nervous, constantly checking over her shoulder. She told me she couldn't stay silent anymore. Her conscience wouldn't let her. She described how Daniel had created fake invoices through his company. How he'd manipulated financial records and court documents with Lila's help. Lila had worked as a paralegal before becoming a real estate agent. She knew exactly how to falsify papers without raising immediate red flags. Nina's voice dropped to a whisper. She pulled a small USB drive from her purse and slid it across the table. "Everything's on here," she said. "But you need to be careful. They're not just liars, Eve. They're thieves. And they're dangerous when cornered." I opened the files that night on my laptop. My hands trembled as I clicked through folder after folder. Offshore bank transfers. Fraudulent business accounts under fake names. Investment schemes that had stolen money from clients. And there, buried in a subfolder labeled Property Assets, I found something that made my stomach turn. Documents showing my name forged as a co-signer on several shady business deals. Digital copies of my signature on contracts I'd never seen. If these schemes collapsed, I'd be legally tied to Daniel's crimes. I could face charges for fraud I didn't commit. I could lose everything, including my freedom. They hadn't just stolen from me during the divorce. They'd set me up to take the fall if anything went wrong. I sat in the darkness of my apartment, the laptop screen glowing in front of me, and felt cold rage settle into my bones. This was war now. I became someone else over the next month. On the surface, I pretended to move on with my life. I posted cheerful photos online with new friends. I even commented on Daniel and Lila's wedding pictures, writing, "Congratulations. Wishing you both happiness." It nearly killed me to type those words, but I needed them to think I'd given up. I needed them comfortable and careless. Meanwhile, Patricia and I built our case in secret. We organized every file from Nina's USB drive. We created timelines and paper trails. We found bank accounts Daniel thought he'd hidden. And then Patricia discovered something that changed everything. One of the properties Daniel had transferred to Lila's name had a title issue. Due to a technicality in the original deed, that property still legally belonged to me. Daniel had made a mistake, and that mistake was going to cost him everything. The invitation came through email. Daniel and Lila wanted to have a closure dinner with me. They said it would help everyone move forward peacefully. They suggested an upscale Italian restaurant downtown. I knew it was probably an attempt to make sure I wouldn't cause problems for them. Maybe they'd heard I was doing well and wanted to keep me quiet. I agreed to meet them. On the night of the dinner, I dressed carefully. A simple black dress, red lipstick, hair straightened and sleek. I looked confident and unbothered. When I arrived, they were already seated. Daniel looked older somehow. Lila's smile was forced. We made small talk about work and weather. Then, halfway through the main course, I reached into my purse. I pulled out a small flash drive and placed it gently on the white tablecloth between us. I leaned forward and whispered, "I wonder what the police would think about this." Then I stood up and walked away without looking back. Daniel's face had drained of all color when I dropped that flash drive on the table. Lila had tried to maintain her composure, but her hands shook so badly she knocked over her wine glass. Red liquid spread across the tablecloth like blood. I'd walked out of that restaurant feeling lighter than I had in years. That night, my phone rang at 11:30. Daniel's name appeared on the screen. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity won. His voice was desperate, pleading. "Eve, please. We need to talk about this. Don't do something you'll regret. We can work this out. I can explain everything." I listened to him beg for 30 seconds. Then I said quietly, "You should have thought about that before you destroyed my life." I hung up and blocked his number. The next morning, I followed through on my promise. I didn't respond to any of Daniel's attempts to contact me. Instead, I sent copies of all the evidence to the tax authority, the state attorney general's office, and the financial crimes division. I did it anonymously through Patricia's office. We'd covered our tracks carefully. Within 48 hours, Daniel's business accounts were frozen. By the end of the week, news broke about an investigation into his company. Local business reporters picked up the story. Local entrepreneur under investigation for financial fraud, the headlines read. I watched it all unfold from the safety of my apartment. Daniel's carefully built reputation crumbled in days. His clients started pulling their contracts. His business partners distanced themselves publicly. And Lila, who'd been so confident at that dinner, suddenly went quiet on social media. Their perfect life was falling apart, and I hadn't even revealed my involvement yet. 3 months after the investigation began, Daniel and Lila faced complete financial ruin. Their assets were seized. The luxury condo was foreclosed. Friends who'd once celebrated their wedding now avoided them in public. I heard through former mutual acquaintances that they were living in a small rental apartment, barely making ends meet. Meanwhile, my life transformed in ways I'd never expected. I got promoted to senior marketing director at my firm. My boss said I'd shown remarkable resilience and strategic thinking. I started volunteering at a women's shelter, mentoring others recovering from toxic marriages. Then I received a call from an investigative journalist named Marcus. He was writing a detailed piece about Daniel's fraud case. He discovered my connection to Daniel and wanted to hear my side of the story. I thought carefully before agreeing. Then I said yes. The interview with Marcus lasted 3 hours. I told him everything under a pseudonym. He promised to protect my identity while sharing the truth about what had happened. When the article published 2 weeks later, it went viral. People shared it across social media platforms. Comments flooded in from others who'd experienced similar betrayals. This woman is a hero. Finally, someone fought back. Her courage is inspiring. The story reached thousands, then hundreds of thousands. Survivors of financial abuse in relationships reached out to thank me. Lawyers contacted Patricia, saying they wanted to use our case as precedent. I'd become an accidental advocate for others who'd been silenced and stolen from. Then, 3 days after the article published, Lila posted something cryptic on her social media: "Be careful who you try to destroy. Karma works both ways." It felt like a threat. And I was right to be worried. The note appeared on my doorstep on a Tuesday morning. Plain white envelope, no return address. Inside was a single typed sentence: "You'll pay for what you've done." My blood ran cold. I immediately called Patricia, who advised me to contact the police and install security cameras. I had the cameras up and running by that evening. 2 days later, the motion sensors triggered at 2 in the morning. I checked the live feed on my phone, heart pounding. A figure stood at my gate. As they moved closer to the camera light, I recognized the blonde hair. It was Lila. But she looked nothing like the confident bride from months ago. She appeared thin, almost fragile. Her hands trembled as she pressed them against the gate. Then she spoke, her voice barely audible through the camera's microphone: "Eve, please. I need help. Please." She looked sick with fear. And despite everything, I felt a flicker of something unexpected. Not pity exactly, but curiosity about what could have broken her so completely. I didn't open the gate that night. Instead, I called Patricia, who advised me to call the police if Lila didn't leave. But before I could, Lila walked away into the darkness. The next morning, she sent me an email. It was long, rambling, desperate. She confessed that Daniel had become violent after the investigation started. He blamed her for everything going wrong. He said she'd been sloppy with the paperwork. He'd hit her twice in the past month. She was terrified of him now. The email continued with shocking details. Daniel had hidden additional assets overseas that even the investigators hadn't found yet. He was planning to flee the country and leave Lila behind to face all the legal consequences alone. She was being investigated too, and her lawyer said she'd likely face prison time. Lila's email ended with a plea, "I know I don't deserve your help. I know what I did was unforgivable. But I'm scared, Eve. Not just of prison. I'm scared of Daniel." I met with Patricia immediately to discuss Lila's email. She suggested we could use Lila's testimony to strengthen the case against Daniel. If Lila cooperated with investigators, she might receive a reduced sentence. More importantly, her insider knowledge could help catch Daniel before he disappeared. I agreed to meet Lila one more time, but only in Patricia's office with cameras recording everything. When Lila arrived, she looked broken. Dark circles shadowed her eyes. Her hands shook constantly. She told us everything. She described how Daniel had manipulated her from the start, how he'd convinced her that I was the villain, how he'd promised they'd build a perfect life together. She showed us bruises on her arms. She handed over documents about Daniel's offshore accounts. Patricia recorded every word legally. We sent the recordings and new evidence to the investigators that same day. 2 weeks later, a warrant was issued for Daniel's arrest. But when police went to serve it, Daniel was already gone. Daniel managed to evade authorities for almost a month. He'd fled to Mexico using a fake passport. But international cooperation and surveillance technology eventually caught up with him at a small airport near Cancun. He was trying to board a plane to Brazil when border agents recognized him. The arrest made national news. Lila testified against him as part of her plea agreement. She received 3 years in prison for her role in the fraud and document falsification. Daniel received 12 years for fraud, tax evasion, money laundering, and witness tampering. I attended the sentencing hearing. I sat quietly in the back row of the courtroom, watching as the judge read the verdict. Daniel turned his head and found me in the crowd. His eyes filled with hatred. As guards led him away, he shouted across the courtroom, "You'll regret this, Eve. You'll regret everything." But his words held no power over me anymore. The months following the trial brought unexpected peace. I felt lighter, as if a weight I'd carried for years had finally lifted. I sold the property that still legally belonged to me, the one Daniel had tried to steal. The sale brought in enough money to rebuild my savings and then some. I donated $10,000 to the women's shelter where I volunteered. I used the rest to buy a small apartment with a balcony overlooking the city. My new place had big windows that let in morning sunlight. I filled it with plants and comfortable furniture. I hung photos of friends and family on the walls. It felt like home in a way the place I'd shared with Daniel never had. Then, 6 months after Daniel's sentencing, a letter arrived in my mailbox. The return address was from a women's correctional facility. It was from Lila. My first instinct was to throw it away. But something made me open it. Lila's letter was 5 pages long, handwritten in careful script. She apologized for everything. She described how Daniel had blackmailed her after their affair started. He'd threatened to expose her involvement in his schemes if she didn't help him. She'd been trapped, too scared to come forward, too deep in lies to escape. She wrote about the guilt that consumed her daily. She said she understood if I could never forgive her, but she needed me to know the truth about Daniel's manipulation. She ended the letter with, "You were always stronger than me, Eve. Even in college, I envied your confidence. I'm sorry I let my weakness destroy our friendship. I hope someday you find peace." I read the letter 3 times. Then I cried. Not for Daniel, not even really for Lila, but for the girl I'd once trusted completely. For the friendship that could have been real if we'd both been braver. I placed the letter in a drawer labeled "Past" and closed it gently. 2 years after everything fell apart, I stood on a small stage at a women's empowerment seminar. I'd been invited to share my story of surviving financial abuse and fighting back. The room held about 200 people, mostly women. As I spoke about recognizing manipulation, about finding strength in darkness, about refusing to be a victim, I noticed someone in the middle row watching me intently. She had a notebook open, writing quickly. When our eyes met, she smiled. I recognized her then. It was Nina, Daniel's former assistant. The woman who'd given me the USB drive that started everything. After my talk ended, Nina approached me. We hugged tightly. She told me she'd gone back to school and was now studying to become a therapist, specializing in helping abuse survivors. She said meeting me had changed her life too. As we talked, I realized something profound. The face that had once represented my deepest betrayal now reminded me of my greatest strength. For the first time, I saw her face again, and this time, it didn't break me. It reminded me how far I'd come.